In bridge engineering with pre-stressed precast concrete beams, there are three major forms of constructions. I'll show you what they are. First one with a shallow, when you have a requirement to have a shallow construction depth, you use infill decks. They would look like something like this. So you have these pre-stress precast units, and then you have this in situ concrete as the infill. One of the major governing points is the construction depth, because they are quite shallow. And one other thing is, when you want to avoid permanent formwork, you will see what that means in the next two forms of construction. When you want to avoid permanent formwork, then you could use this form of construction. But this would ideally or economically work with shorter spans. You cannot really use with longer span or even medium, anything more than 15-17 meters, because you're adding quite a lot of additional self-weight with the infill rather than using a slab on top of the beams. And the second major form would be precast beams with slab on top. They would look something like this. As you can see here, when you compare with this one, the beams are a bit deeper, but the slab on top of the beams, they are not as big as this one. It's quite thin. This sort of arrangement you use typically in medium span bridges, because you can get rid of the infill in between the pre-stressed beams, like in the first form of construction. However, one important thing is you need to ideally use permanent formwork to support your slab on top of these beams. The first form of construction, you don't need to use permanent formwork. You use a filler in between these beams, and it's not necessary. It's when you want to minimize the amount of inspection required underneath the slab, you would use the first form of construction. And when you want to go for longer span, you would use voided slab. It would look like something like this. slab on top. Again, this would be permanent formwork. You would use this form of construction for longer span because you can get rid of a lot of self weight, and of course you can see when you compare this form of construction with the first two, the beams look quite deep. Again, this form of construction is good for longer span. However, you need to have access to carry out inspection. Not necessarily this particular area, because most of the time it's not accessible.